Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Universal Design for Learning Core Session 1, Why Universal Design for Learning is More Important Than Ever.
My name is Garrett Gilmer. I'm the Executive Director of Counseling and Psychological Services here at Northwestern University.
And my name is Una McGeough. I am a Program Manager in the Office of Academic Support and Learning Advancement, also at Northwestern University. So just to give you a sense of what we're going to do today, we're going to be giving you a context for UDL. We're going to be looking at student well-being nationally and at Northwestern. We're going to be looking at the impacts of disruptions on students. We're also going to be looking at instructor experiences and using all of that to frame a rationale for UDL. So you might start by just thinking a little bit about your experience teaching during the pandemic, whether that was this current last quarter or semester or March 2020 or somewhere in between. It's been a long, varied, and challenging journey, moving from a global crisis to a set of chronic challenges. To this presentation, we have a couple of articles, one from the Chronicle of Higher Education entitled A Stunning Level of Human Disconnection, another from the New York Times, My College Students Are Not Okay. And as part of these articles, we saw a whole array of different manifestations of student well-being and lack of well-being. We saw disengagement, decreased academic performance, increased exhaustion, anxiety, an uptick in mental health referrals. We also found, although higher ed institutions tried very hard to accommodate students, that looser standards were not always helpful. One of the articles goes into a great deal of detail about how the looser standards kind of contributed to a lack of connection, engagement, a feeling of accountability and participation that were actually important to student well-being. As you go through those articles, you'll see many quotes about the student experience and what instructors were seeing and the challenges that everybody was facing. This gives you another opportunity to explore some discussion questions. For example, what resonated with you from the articles? What was it like from your perspective as an instructor? And any other observations that come to mind. My office, the Academic Support and Learning Advancement Office at Northwestern, we moved all of our programs to online and went through the various remote to hybrid to in-person formats that many institutions faced. And during that time, we connected regularly with the students who led our programs, as well as the students they worked with, to find out what was going on for all of them. And as you can see from this chart, there was such a huge array of types of worries and anxieties that students were experiencing. They ranged from a long list of academic stressors, and then outside of the academic world, financial, health, family worries, social worries regarding how to connect with others, feeling lonely, feeling isolated. These are some of the challenges that students described. And one of the things that we noticed was that you couldn't tell which students were the students leading the study sessions and which students were the students participating, because everybody was struggling in some way or another. It's also important to note that not every student experienced all of this. Some students were in comfortable situations, felt safe, supported, and were able to take extra courses. And sometimes they were thriving because they did not feel the pressures of attending college in the normal way. So it's important to know that not every experience is exactly the same, but that many challenges have ensued. So let's discuss well-being in more detail.
So I'm going to spend some time talking with you all a little bit about some of the trends in mental health, some of the national trends, and then I'll kind of talk a little bit about what we saw here at Northwestern. The data that I'm sharing on national trends really comes from the Center for Collegiate Mental Health, which is collects data from a lot of different counseling centers across the nation. It's a great resource to kind of really help us get a handle on sort of where we're going and what's working, what may not be working. So this first slide really looks at the top concerns, the reasons why students come into counseling centers across our campuses. For the longest time, depression was the number one reason for people seeking mental health services at universities. But some time ago, anxiety really overtook as the number one concern. And what we know is that that continues to be the trend. We saw definitely an uptick in anxiety during the pandemic, and social anxiety is really one of the biggest components of when you break out the different kinds of anxiety for that uptick. This table talks about some trends related to severity. And so many counseling centers use a symptom checklist called the CCAPS 34. So it has 34 different questions that really looks at different symptomologies and then puts them on these different scales. And so what we're seeing in this table is that just about at every category, with the exception of two, that the severity has increased from 2010 to 2021. So depression scores are getting worse, anxiety scores are getting worse. The areas that we are seeing some improvement are in hostility, so anger or threats to others, which is a good thing. And then alcohol use is also been improved. But we know nationally folks are at this age range are using alcohol less, preferring other substances, especially cannabis. So if we dig in a little deeper on this slide, there's a bunch of tables here that talk about some other factors that help us get a sense of severity. So things like prior treatment or prior mental health services, levels of threat to self or others, and traumatic experiences, and then drug and alcohol use. And again, you're going to see a pretty consistent trend where most of these situations, we've seen increasing levels of severity with some few exceptions. As I spoke about earlier, we're seeing lower rates of binge drinking, but increases in the use of marijuana. Nationally, we're seeing increases. We had been seeing increases in utilization. So the percentage of our campuses that were served by our counseling services had been going up. During the pandemic, however, we saw a drop in that. And so that was interesting. And I think counterintuitive to what most people thought, because we knew and we were hearing, and there was national conversations about the impact of the pandemic on our mental health, our collective mental health. The reasons I believe that we saw this happen is because folks were not on campus. And so they were using mental health services in their home communities that they may have already been connected to versus transitioning them to campus. And also there was less surveillance. There was less of a community that was identifying and referring folks for those services during that time. We are starting to see a return to more normal pre-pandemic rates, and I anticipate that will continue to grow in the coming years. So here at Northwestern, in terms of presenting concerns, anxiety, just like the national data showed, is the number one reason. Anxiety continues to be the number one reason for folks coming in with depression and relationship problems, really kind of coming up in the next in second place on those. So really typical for this age group. And I think students are very comfortable kind of describing their mental health struggles in terms of stress and anxiety and worries versus sadness. And so that makes sense to me and feels congruent. So next slide shows the severity that we're seeing at CAPS at Northwestern. So each of these sets of bars is one of those scales on that CCAPS, that symptom checklist that I spoke to earlier. And as I said before, you're seeing the severity sort of creep up, with the exception of those pandemic years where we saw less of that. And so maybe some drop in severity. And the reason, again, for that, I think, is because folks were not being identified and being encouraged to seek help, or folks who had more severe concerns were already engaged in treatments in their home communities. And so that wasn't showing up in our counseling centers on campuses. But you'll notice prior to that, there had been an increase in those numbers. And then similar to the national data in terms of utilization of the counseling service at Northwestern, we were seeing increases until the pandemic, and then we saw a drop. It wasn't the complete, nobody was using CAPS, but that steady increase that had been occurring all of a sudden stopped. And some of this also, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a bit, had to do with some staffing challenges that university counseling centers have seen nationwide, which really reduced our capacities to provide services at the same rates. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the far-reaching social concerns related to the pandemic. So we were all impacted by this in different ways, and we can all remember those days and those months. But it really led to folks feeling more and more isolated socially, which is a difficult for our college students. It's a difficult time to feel socially isolated and to be apart from. There is, for many, some interrupted or delayed achievement of expected developmental milestones, specifically social ones, right? Like knowing how to negotiate relationships, more mature, romantic relationships. Those sorts of things just weren't happening for folks, and they weren't developing those skills in the same way. Significant and pervasive grief and loss reactions. So many folks lost loved ones during this time. And so that was, complicating all of the rest of it, and also creating an increased anxiety for their own safety, given the fact that they witnessed others who were lost to the pandemic. And it's important, you'll see this note at the bottom of the next several slides, that, there was a whole group of folks at universities trying to support students going through these things, but they were not immune to these impacts either. So they were having their own reactions in much of these same ways, while still trying to help folks who are going through that. And it often, I think, felt like, for many, the blind leading the blind, like we're wanting to be helpful, but we really don't know how to work through it ourselves. And so, I think we did amazing work in that time, but it was very, very taxing for many folks in and outside of counseling centers who were in these helping roles. You'll see on this slide that, according to the Center for Collegiate Mental Health, they sort of reached out and through the participating schools, and they were asking students how many of these different areas on the table on the right were impacted by the pandemic. And so the graph on the left side shows, what percentage said 1, what percentage said 2, and you'll see that 80% or almost 90% said at least 2 areas were impacted, and about half said 6 or more were impacted. So you could see that the impact of the pandemic just was far-reaching and just affected everything that we were doing, and we really didn't have any good sanctuaries from the impacts. And that toll, I think, is evident. We're all experiencing it now, and we'll be experiencing it for some time, because the folks that are coming into universities and will be coming in for the next several years were impacted by this at whatever age they were. And so we'll be seeing the impact of that showing up for a whole generation, if not longer. But then there was also a lot of racial injustice happening in our societies. And so that resulted in some collective and repeated trauma experiences, as we were witnessing some really violent events and being subjected to those in the media and social media in ways that I think were different than maybe before. I think people were having a harder time sort of opting into that. It was just sort of showing up. And I think there was for good reasons, and had a positive outcome to some degree. There was some very deliberate attention being placed on these events, but that also came with a toll and a stress. And for some, it resulted in a distrust of systems, especially among our BIPOC students, including distrust of mental health systems. And so the concern there, obviously, is that then if you don't trust a system, you're less likely to reach out for help and assistance. And so then that leads more to a likelihood of folks languishing when they're struggling. A lot of folks, experience a loss of hope that things will ever get better. A real fatigue, working to be part of changing and dismantling systems of oppression, but then seeing these things continue to happen really was tiring for many people and led to a lot of anger, understandable. In addition, there's political divisions in our country that were existing during this time and continue to exist. With this, you see, and I'm sure many of us experienced, some increased conflict in some of our relationships that led to some anger. For many, there's a sort of pervasive pessimism about the future. And for some, a pressure to become politically active, even though that may not be sort of a real calling for them, but then there's like an expectation to be active in ways that are not a good fit for them. And then we have climate change. We're hearing a lot about this and the impact that that's having on folks' mental health related to anger for why previous generations have allowed things to get to this point, some anxiety about what's going to happen within our lifetime, what will they have to live through in terms of climate disasters, sense of helplessness. Is it too late to fix any of this? Or even if it's not too late, is there any hope? Because is the world going to rally and fix these sorts of things? So it creates a lot of sort of just insecurity on a large scale that I think is unique to this time. And economic uncertainties. So in a very similar way, we saw folks really struggling with changes to our economy, inflation, people's jobs being lost or needing to change up in order to care for family members, different employment outlooks than they had anticipated. So there's a lot of uncertainty for students about their future and the kinds of employment that they were wanting to get and whether those opportunities will be there for them. A lot of pressure to excel for these reasons, to kind of make sure that we're, pursuing a field that's associated with a good paying, lucrative job, which may or may not always be connected to our passions. So then we have people studying and toiling in areas that they're not being rewarded by in the same ways that we would ideally hope for them. So all this results sort of in some challenges for universities related to the mental well-being of students. So I've talked about earlier about some staffing challenges, and we really saw a period of time, and most industries did, and certainly lots of areas within universities saw this, where people were leaving university jobs. And we saw this at university counseling centers, people leaving at numbers that were really never seen before. And we had a period of time, I would say at least a year, where we have really difficult time recruiting folks to come work at the university providing the services. I will say, fortunately, we've started to see a shift in that, and we've been having more success in getting really strong pools for our open positions. And I'm hopeful that that trend will continue. But I do know that there are many schools who continue to struggle in this way. We're seeing increasing numbers of students going to college with pre-existing mental health concerns. So, really needing to think through what does that mean in terms of the kinds of supports that need to exist for them. So beyond just the counseling center, but how are learning spaces set up for them, how are living spaces set up for them, to make sure that we can accommodate, kind of what other parts of them are exist that need to be considered in how they interact with our communities. There's some unhealthy aspects of our university cultures and systemic and pervasive systems of racism and oppression. Most institutions of higher education sort of are rooted in systems of oppression and white supremacy, and I think that is felt in different degrees depending on who we are and our unique identities, and it creates a lot of threats to the mental health and well-being of our students and the folks who are trying to support them. Universities can be very competitive spaces that do not encourage help seeking or peer supports, because folks are in competition for opportunities and those sorts of things. And we're not always the best at modeling self-care and boundaries for our students. And so, really needing to think about some of those pieces as well. But there's opportunities. And I tend to like to focus on those. So I think there's opportunities for more systemic and intentional focus on true prevention efforts. So ones that really foster healthy environments that promote and sustain well-being for students. and that develop and empower communities of care so that students are less likely to struggle in silence or alone. And efforts that normalize struggles and setbacks and support students in recovering and learning from those moments rather than teaching students that those events are avoidable if they only work hard enough, right? So helping folks know that setbacks and struggles, failures even, are part of the process, and those are just learning moments. We need to take bold action to identify and disrupt and remove elements of oppression and racism that have been allowed to operate in our communities. We can continue to leverage, I think we've been doing some amazing work here, but continue to leverage what we've learned about some of the new or new to us technologies that were introduced because of the pandemic, so that we can foster new ways for folks to connect for support. We really learned that there's a group of folks who were showing up for mental health services that maybe never would have if they had to come in person. So the virtual option opened up a door, an avenue for students who never would have sought services. And we need to continue to reimagine employer and employee relationships and expectations given what many learned during the pandemic about work-life balance, so that we can continue to provide employment opportunities where people can thrive, and really focusing on the passions that they have for the work of student support, and not burn out all of the talented folks and have sort of folks leaving, prematurely into other fields.
So we know that instructors were aware of the many challenges students were experiencing. You may not have been aware of the numbers and the specific data, but we know that you have been managing since March 2020 a variety of challenging circumstances and have maintained as much as possible a productive learning environment. You've been making creative adaptations to meet the circumstances and finding ways to help your students despite all the challenges of the last few years. So we invite you here to think a little bit about how you adapted, experimented, and improvised some of the things that you might have tried in your classroom. Reflect a little bit on how it worked and what you've learned from that. You may not have really realized it when you were doing it, but it's likely that some of the approaches you discussed and implemented are in fact approaches from Universal Design for Learning. For example, flexible grading and attendance policies, perhaps multiple ways to access lectures, especially recording lectures, and so on. Much of what you experimented with is Universal Design for Learning. By extending those approaches in a systematic way, which we'll be covering in future sessions of this resource, you will gain efficiencies and reduce the amount of time you have to spend managing individual students' needs. So just again, sharing a little bit of Northwestern specific data. We know that institutions may vary in the details, but many of the general trends, patterns, and conclusions will be universal. Accessible NU, which is the Disability Accessibility Office at Northwestern, saw the requests for note takers since March 2020 declined by 60% because the prevalence of classroom lecture recordings allowed students to effectively take their own notes. Both our Accessible NU office and our Academic Support office heard many stories of students being helped by these flexible approaches and accommodations that were employed. Students with ADHD appreciated having class recordings during remote learning. That gave them something to go back to when they forgot something from class, got distracted, or were unable to focus during lecture. Students with depression appreciated the recordings because if there were days they were unable to get themselves to class, they were able to get the information later on, and there were no questions asked. There was no shame involved in explaining why they had missed the lecture. It reduced anxiety in that domain. The flexibility offered throughout remote learning was very helpful to the majority of Accessible NU students. So those adaptations that instructors made across the board had a discernible impact on student experiences during a really difficult time. That being said, there continues to be a need and a demand. Here at Northwestern, 43% of accessible Northwestern students report a psychological condition as either their primary or secondary disability. That doesn't include the many students who aren't actually registered with Accessible NU. And the other thing we know is that these numbers are growing every year. So another resource that we link to is a TED Talk called The Myth of Average by Todd Ross. And so that recording, if you have a chance to watch that video, it's not very long, and it talks about this idea of how using averages can actually be not very helpful. So going back to our institution, we know that the average Northwestern student is pretty exceptional. After that, there's a lot of variability. Often when we talk about that average Northwestern student, we cite a GPA, a high school class rank, an SAT score, or an ACT score, or AP test scores. But beyond that, there really is no average Northwestern student. So for example, just looking at the class of 2025 demographics, this is undergraduates, but we have a lot of diversity and variability in our graduate population too. So these are some of the things that Northwestern explicitly tracks, in addition to some of these elements which focus on first generation, Pell Grant recipients, underrepresented minorities. Northwestern also tracks gender, race, ethnicity, and where students come from. Just like in this graph, there's a lot of variability. As we consider that variability, we have many international students who may have significant variability in their English language skills, spoken, oral, written comprehension, also writing skills, and this affects their learning profile. We also know that ethnicities and income groups were not equally affected by the pandemic and other events of recent years. So as we've discussed, there have been significant concerns about student well-being over the last couple of years. This matters because we care about the well-being of students here, and we want them to thrive both academically and holistically. And we want to be able to help them learn. And sometimes that means we need to go beyond what we can see. So thinking about a learning profile, as talked about in the Myth of Average recording, there are so many things that contribute to a student's learning profile that we don't see. On this slide, you see some of them: background knowledge, language skills we talked about, in particular for international students, curiosity and interest, intrinsic motivation versus the need for extrinsic motivators, ability to focus, self-confidence, the variety of impacts students experience, stressors that affect their ability to learn. And so we know that students can have what we would call jagged learning profiles. Even though they all may have these wonderful SAT or ACT scores, they're not all the same. And this is at least as true of graduate students as it is of undergraduate students. Means that even smart students struggle. Even the most intellectually talented students, if we look at students attending universities across the country, they have proven themselves in many ways, and that doesn't mean that they will not encounter challenges. The challenges aren't all the same, either in the root causes or in how they manifest in the classroom. If you add onto that the massive stress and upheaval of the last over 3 years now, and how those stressors have affected students, we can see that there's no one typical or average source of mental health strain or of how it manifests itself for students, how it impacts their ability to learn in the classroom. So if you think about having one size fitting all, assuming an average or typical impact on students, an average or typical impact on learning, there's no such thing. One size fits all actually doesn't really fit anybody. So what does universal design for learning offer? It decreases the need for special considerations and therefore reduces instructor workload. Going back to the idea that many of you made adaptations in your courses during the most intense periods of the pandemic, some of those were one-off, improvised solutions to difficult problems. When you take a universal design for learning approach, you are systematizing those approaches instead of having to make special exceptions, either for a special course or for an individual student who requests them. By making those adaptations universal, you reduce the sense of shame for students. You don't require students to request accommodations. Instead, you create a learning environment that adapts to everyone. The idea of designing around the edges is a design approach that optimizes things for as many people as possible, instead of designing for an average or typical student who may not actually exist. As we noted before, many students have psychological conditions, and that number is growing. And having ways where we can help them be successful learners in the classroom is essential. Looking ahead to the future elements of this UDL resource, we will be talking about multiple means of engagement in the next session, which is a way of providing different ways to build student connection to courses as a way to foster better learning through being more inclusive. We will also talk about multiple means of representation. Providing more than one way to access information can benefit all of students' learning and their mental health. Finally, offering multiple means of expression of knowledge and understanding means that you're offering more than one way to approach assessment, and that can reduce student anxiety while maintaining rigor in the classroom. We'll talk about pinch points, stumbling points in your course, places where you notice consistently that students struggle as a place you can focus your efforts in implementing UDL. And we'll talk about the idea that this can be implemented in small steps. You don't have to overhaul everything all at once. You can make one little change at a time and see where that will take you. So we look forward to sharing more of these techniques with you in the future sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.